They called it Code Black at Norfolk Naval Hospital, not because of the patient, but because of the 80-pound war machine that wouldn't let him go. At 2:47 a.m. on a rain-soaked Tuesday in November, the emergency department of one of America's premier military medical centers was under siege. Not by terrorists, not by armed gunmen, but by a Belgian Malinois named Valkyrie, who had decided that every human being in the building was a threat to her fallen handler. The dog stood atop the body of Master Sergeant Declan Riggs, all four paws planted on the corners of the gurney like a living gargoyle. Her coat, the color of burnt caramel streaked with black, was soaked through from the storm outside. Water dripped from her muzzle onto the thermal blanket covering the corpse. Her ears were pinned flat against her skull. Her lips were peeled back to expose teeth that weren't just sharp, they were capped in titanium. Instruments of war designed to crush bone and sever arteries. She didn't bark. That would have been a warning, a negotiation. Instead, Valkyrie emitted a sound that seemed to vibrate through the tile floor and up into the bones of everyone watching. A tectonic rumble that came from somewhere deep in her chest cavity, primal and utterly terrifying. Dr. Marcus Sterling, the attending trauma surgeon, stood 15 feet back from the sealed glass doors of Trauma Bay 1. He was a man who measured his worth in lives saved and seconds shaved off response times. He had sutured bleeding organs while mortar shells fell on field hospitals in Mosul. He had cracked open chests and massaged hearts back to life with his bare hands. But he had never, in 23 years of emergency medicine, been held hostage by a dog. "This is insane," Sterling muttered, checking his watch for the 14th time. "We have a deceased serviceman decomposing in my ER, and we're being held at bay by an animal." "That is not an animal, doctor." The voice came from Agent Wesley Cross, one of two men in dark suits who had arrived in an unmarked SUV with government plates 20 minutes after the helicopter touched down. Cross was Department of Defense, though his exact title remained conveniently vague. He stood with his arms crossed, watching the standoff through the observation window with the detached interest of someone evaluating a science experiment. "That," Cross continued, nodding toward Valkyrie, "is a JSOC multi-purpose canine, Joint Special Operations Command. Her training cost taxpayers approximately $78,000. She holds an official rank higher than yours, technically, and she is trained to kill enemy combatants in 12 different ways, 3 of which don't leave visible marks until the autopsy." Sterling's face flushed purple. "I don't care if she has a PhD and a Purple Heart. She is preventing us from processing a body. I have patients backing up in the waiting room. I am authorizing Norfolk PD to neutralize the threat. You can't shoot her." The voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Everyone turned. Standing in the corner of the observation deck, partially hidden behind a supply cart, was the hospital's newest hire. Reese Kincaid was 28 years old, though the exhaustion etched into the corners of her eyes made her look older. She had been a registered nurse at Norfolk Naval for exactly 8 weeks and 3 days. Her dirty blonde hair was pulled back in a messy bun that violated about 6 different dress code regulations. Her scrubs hung loose on a frame that looked like it had forgotten how to eat regularly. The other nurses called her the Ghost because of how silently she moved through the halls, how she seemed to materialize at a patient's bedside without anyone noticing her approach. The doctors called her competent but timid, the kind of nurse who was great at following orders but terrible at taking initiative. Right now, her hands were shaking so badly she had to shove them into her pockets. "Excuse me?" Dr. Sterling turned his glare on her like a spotlight. "Nurse Kincaid, I don't recall asking for your input." Reese swallowed hard. Her voice came out thin and reedy. "If you shoot her, she'll tear through that glass door before the bullet even registers. That's not aggression. She's scared." "Scared?" Sterling scoffed. "That animal just tried to remove Officer Daniel's face when he approached with a catch pole." Because she thinks you're hurting him. Reese took a small step forward, her eyes fixed not on the humans in the room, but on the dog beyond the glass. She's guarding the 6 o'clock position, the rear. She thinks her handler is unconscious and vulnerable. She won't let anyone near him until... Reese's voice trailed off. Her face had gone pale. Until what? Agent Cross asked, studying her with sudden interest. Until the handler gives the release command, Reese whispered. She's waiting for him to wake up and tell her the mission is over. Sterling laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. Well, that handler isn't waking up, sweetheart. Master Sergeant Riggs was declared deceased at 1:30 hours by the flight medic. He's been dead for over an hour. And if that dog doesn't stand down in the next 10 minutes, she's going to be joining him. The door to the observation deck opened with a pneumatic hiss. Captain Vincent Briggs of the Norfolk PD SWAT unit entered, followed by 2 of his men. Briggs was built like a fire hydrant, short, thick, and utterly immovable. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had resolved 347 critical incidents without a single civilian casualty. This would not be 348. Gentlemen, Briggs said, nodding to the assembled group. His eyes lingered on Reese for half a second before dismissing her entirely. I've been briefed on the situation. We have 2 options. Option 1, we sedate the animal with a tranquilizer rifle. Problem is, at this distance and through that gap in the door, we're looking at maybe a 60% hit probability. If we miss and just make her angrier, she goes through that glass before the drugs take effect. We'd need to put her down anyway. And option 2? Cross asked. Briggs' expression didn't change. We don't miss. 1 shot, high caliber, through the opening. The animal is neutralized. We recover the remains, and everyone goes home. Sterling nodded immediately. Do it. Wait. Cross held up a hand. That dog is a decorated military asset. She's completed 47 operational missions across 3 theaters. She's detected IEDs that saved hundreds of lives. The optics alone... The optics, Sterling interrupted, his voice rising, are that we have a biohazard situation and a public safety threat. Agent Cross, unless you want to go in there yourself and sweet-talk the dog, I suggest you step aside and let the professionals handle this. Cross's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He stepped back. Briggs gestured to his sniper, a lanky kid named Ramirez who looked barely old enough to drink. Ramirez began assembling a tripod in the hallway, lining up a sight picture through the 2-inch gap where the glass doors didn't quite meet. The sound of metal clicking against metal filled the corridor. Reese felt her stomach plummet into her shoes. Her hands curled into fists in her pockets, nails digging into her palms hard enough to draw blood. She could see the red dot of the laser sight dancing on the wall just past Valkyrie's shoulder. The dog's ears swiveled toward the sound, and her growl deepened, vibrating through the glass. No, Reese said. The word came out louder than she intended. Heads turned. Doctor, Sterling's face darkened. Nurse Kincaid, get back to your station or get out. You can't shoot her. Reese's voice was shaking, but she took another step forward. She's just doing her job. She's waiting for the release protocol. We don't have time for this, Sterling snapped. Officer, take your shot when ready. I can do it. The words hung in the air like smoke. Everyone stared at Reese. Her face was flushed now, 2 spots of color high on her pale cheeks. She looked simultaneously terrified and furious, like a rabbit that had decided to stop running and turn to face the wolf. Sterling blinked. You, what? I can calm her down. Reese's hands were out of her pockets now, held stiffly at her sides. I know Malinois. I know the protocol. Give me 5 minutes. If I can't get her to stand down, then you can do what you have to do. Absolutely not, Sterling said flatly. You're a nurse who fainted last month during a compound fracture reduction. You're going to walk into a sealed room with a trained killer? This isn't a Disney movie, Kincaid. She's right, though. The new voice came from the far end of the hallway. It was rough and gravelly, like tires on gravel, and it carried the kind of authority that made everyone instinctively straighten up. A man in a wheelchair rolled into view. He was old, anywhere between 65 and 100, it was hard to tell. His face was a roadmap of scars and sun damage, with deep lines carved around his mouth and eyes. His hair was steel gray, cut in a military-precise high and tight that had probably looked the same for 40 years. He wore faded jeans and a black t-shirt that read, Delta Force, because Special Forces needed someone to look up to. But it was his eyes that commanded attention. Chips of blue ice that had seen things most people couldn't imagine and had decided to keep living anyway. "And who the hell are you?" Sterling demanded. The man in the wheelchair stopped a few feet from the group. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried the weight of someone who had given orders that sent men to their deaths and had learned to live with it. Sergeant Major Dutch Holloway, U.S. Army Delta Force, retired. I ran the K-9 integration program at Bragg for 12 years before an insurgent decided my spine looked better in pieces. He looked at Captain Briggs. "And I'm the one they called to consult on this clusterfuck, because apparently nobody in this building knows a damn thing about working dogs." Dutch's eyes locked onto Reese. There was recognition there, sharp and immediate, though he kept his expression neutral. "You're Kincaid," he said. It wasn't a question. Reese's breath caught. "Yes, Sergeant Major. Helmand Province, Medical K-9 Handler, 2018. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Reese's face went from flushed to ashen in the span of a heartbeat. Her hands started trembling again. Yes, sir. That was a long time ago." 6 years, Dutch said. "Not that long." His eyes flicked to her forearms, where the sleeves of her scrubs covered something the others couldn't see. "You trained Valkyrie, didn't you?" Agent Cross stepped forward. "Wait, you're telling me our timid ICU nurse is a former military K-9 handler? That's not in her employment records." "That's because I didn't put it in my employment records," Reese said quietly. Her voice had changed. There was steel in it now, cold and hard. "I left the service in 2020. I don't do that work anymore." "Why not?" Cross asked. Reese's jaw tightened. "Because the last time I worked with combat dogs, 4 people died." Silence crashed over the group like a wave. Dutch broke it. "3, he said firmly. 3 people died, and it wasn't your fault." "The investigation said, the investigation was garbage," Dutch cut her off. "But we're not here to litigate the past. We're here to solve a problem." He turned his wheelchair to face Dr. Sterling. "That dog in there isn't going to respond to tranquilizers or bullets. She's in full guardian mode. The only thing that's going to bring her down is someone she recognizes as pack authority. And the only person in this building who has that authority is standing right here." Sterling looked at Reese like he was seeing her for the first time. "You really think you can get that animal to stand down?" "I don't know," Reese admitted. Her hands were still shaking, but her voice was steady. "But I know that if you shoot her, you'll have to shoot through me. Because I'm not going to stand here and watch another war dog die because humans failed to understand her." Dutch's lips twitched in something that might have been approval. "That's the Kincaid I remember." Captain Briggs looked between Reese and the dog in the trauma bay. "If we let you go in there and she latches onto you, we shoot through you. You understand that? We can't risk her getting loose in the hospital." "I understand," Reese said. "You have 3 minutes, Sterling said, checking his watch. 180 seconds. If that dog is still aggressive at the end of that time, Officer Ramirez takes the shot. Are we clear?" "Crystal." Reese walked toward the glass doors. Each step felt like moving through wet concrete. Behind her, she could hear the murmur of voices, Sterling giving orders, Cross making a phone call, Dutch's wheelchair creaking as he positioned himself for a better view. Her hand reached for the button that would open the pneumatic doors. "Kincaid," she turned. Dutch had rolled up beside her. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear it. You know what you're walking into? A dog that's scared and confused and thinks her handler is dying. You know what's really in there? Reese met his eyes. There was something in them, a warning maybe, or a question he couldn't ask out loud. No, Sergeant Major, I don't. Then trust your training. And Kincaid? Dutch's expression softened fractionally. She's been waiting for you. All this time, she's been waiting. Before Reese could ask what that meant, Dutch rolled backward, giving her space. Reese pressed the button. The glass doors began to slide open with a hiss of compressed air. The smell hit her immediately. Wet dog, copper blood, and something else, something chemical and wrong that she couldn't quite identify. The temperature inside the trauma bay was at least 10 degrees cooler than the hallway. Valkyrie's head snapped toward the opening door. The dog moved with liquid speed, dropping from the gurney, implanting herself between Reese and the body of Master Sergeant Riggs. She lowered her center of gravity, coiling every muscle like a spring under tension. Her eyes, deep amber, almost gold, locked onto Reese with predatory focus. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. Then Valkyrie lunged forward 2 steps and released a bark that wasn't sound so much as physical force. It echoed off the tile walls like a gunshot. Several of the observers outside jerked backward involuntarily. Reese didn't flinch. She didn't run. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't make eye contact. Instead, she turned her body sideways, presenting a smaller profile, non-threatening. She looked at Valkyrie's front paws, not her face, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Fuss. It was German, the command for heel. Valkyrie's ears twitched forward. She knew the word, but she didn't obey. She took another step toward Reese, hackles raised so high she looked twice her normal size. A line of drool hung from her lower jaw. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, not from exertion, but from stress so intense it was approaching overload. 5 feet separated them now. 1 lunge, 1 bite. That's all it would take. Outside the glass, Officer Ramirez adjusted his aim fractionally. The red dot of his laser sight painted a circle on the wall just behind Valkyrie's skull. Reese saw it. She knew she had maybe 10 seconds before the decision was taken out of her hands. Words wouldn't work. Valkyrie was too far into the red zone, that psychological state where training is overridden by pure instinct, where the thinking brain shuts down and only the survival brain remains. She needed to give Valkyrie something to recognize, something that would cut through the fear and confusion and reach whatever small part of the dog's mind still remembered who she had been before this nightmare began. Slowly, moving at the pace of glaciers forming, of continents drifting, Reese raised her left arm. Valkyrie's growl intensified. Her muscles bunched. The laser sight on the wall steadied. Reese gripped the cuff of her scrub sleeve with her right hand, and in one smooth motion, she rolled it up past her elbow, past the faint white lines of old scars, all the way to her shoulder. There, inked into the pale skin of her inner forearm, in stark black, was a tattoo that hadn't seen daylight in 6 years. It wasn't a butterfly or a flower. It wasn't decorative at all. It was a medical caduceus, the staff with 2 snakes wound around it, crossed with a K9 paw print. Below that, in sharp military stencil font, CMK9-H/Helmand 2018, Combat Medical K9 Handler. Valkyrie froze. Her head tilted to the side, ears swiveling forward. The growl died in her throat, replaced by a sharp intake of breath that sounded almost like a sob. Her eyes, those predatory amber eyes, focused on the tattoo with laser intensity. Then they traveled up to Reese's face, really looking at her for the first time. Recognition sparked like flint striking steel. Reese tapped the tattoo twice with her right index finger. Then she dropped to her knees on the blood-spattered floor, putting herself at Valkyrie's level. Vulnerable. Exposed. Valkyrie, she said, and her voice cracked on the name. Stand down, girl, Overwatch is complete. The dog trembled. She looked at the body on the gurney, then back at Reese, then at the tattoo. Her breathing hitched. She took one tentative step forward. Reese stayed perfectly still. Valkyrie took another step, then another, close enough now that Reese could smell her. Wet fur and gun oil, and something wild and indefinable. The dog sniffed the air around Reese's outstretched arm. She was smelling for something specific, some scent memory buried under 6 years of separation and trauma. She found it. Beneath the hospital antiseptic and the cheap body wash, and the lingering smell of cigarette smoke from the nurse's station, there was something else, something older. Gun oil from weapons long since cleaned, desert dust from a place neither of them would ever return to. And underneath it all, the ghost of betadine and blood, the smell of battlefield medicine, of emergency surgery performed in dirt and darkness, the smell of trust. Valkyrie let out a sound that shattered the hearts of everyone watching. It was a whimper, high and broken and utterly desolate. The sound of a warrior finally allowed to stop fighting. The sound of someone who had been holding the line alone for so long that they'd forgotten what it felt like to have backup. She walked straight up to Reese and pressed her massive head into the woman's chest, knocking the wind out of her. Reese wrapped both arms around the dog's neck and buried her face in wet fur that smelled like rain and war. She started crying, silent tears at first, then racking sobs that shook her entire frame. "I know," she whispered into Valkyrie's ear. "I know, girl. I know you're tired. I know you've been waiting. I'm here now. I'm here." Outside the glass, Dutch Holloway lowered his head. His weathered hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair hard enough to turn his knuckles white. Agent Cross slowly removed his sunglasses. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "She's not just a handler, she's the handler." "Doctor." Sterling stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, watching something he had never expected to see in his sterile, controlled environment. Raw, unfiltered connection between two souls who had survived hell together. Officer Ramirez lowered his rifle. Inside Trauma Bay 1, Reese and Valkyrie stayed locked together for what felt like an eternity and no time at all. Eventually, Reese pulled back just enough to cup the dog's face in both hands. She ran her thumbs over the scarred muzzle, checking for injuries with practiced efficiency. "Brave girl," she whispered. "Such a brave girl. You did your job. You protected him. Now it's time to—" Valkyrie suddenly pulled away from Reese's grip. She turned and walked back to the gurney, hopped up, and placed both front paws squarely on Master Sergeant Riggs's chest. Then she looked directly at Reese and barked. Once, sharp and insistent. Reese's blood ran cold. "What's she doing?" Sterling's voice crackled through the intercom speaker. "Kincaid, get the dog out of there so we can process the body." But Reese wasn't listening. She was staring at Valkyrie with dawning horror. Because she knew that bark. She had heard it dozens of times in Afghanistan, in the rubble and chaos of bombed-out buildings and collapsed tunnels. It was Valkyrie's alert bark, the one she used when she found a survivor buried in debris, the one that meant life detected. "Doctor." "Sterling," Reese said slowly, her voice cutting through the intercom like ice. "Bring the crash cart." "What?" "Kincaid, the man is—" "Bring the goddamn crash cart," Reese screamed, her composure shattering like glass. "She's alerting. She's signaling a live find." Sterling's voice came back laced with condescension. "Nurse Kincaid, Master Sergeant Riggs was pronounced dead 90 minutes ago. The flight medic called it. We have no pulse, no respirations, fixed and dilated pupils." Reese was already moving. She grabbed a stethoscope from the wall mount and shoved Valkyrie gently aside. The dog moved but didn't leave the gurney, watching Reese with intensity that could have burned through steel. Reese ripped open the thermal blanket covering Riggs' body. She jammed the stethoscope into her ears and pressed the bell against the cold, motionless chest. Silence. Nothing but the ambient hum of the ventilation system and her own pulse hammering in her ears. She closed her eyes, pressed harder, and waited. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15, then, so faint she almost missed it. Thump. It wasn't a heartbeat. It was barely an echo of one, a whisper of electrical activity struggling through dying muscle tissue. Reese waited, counted. 20 seconds, 30. Thump. "Oh my God," she breathed. She looked up at the observation window where Dutch, Sterling, and the others were pressed against the glass. "He's not dead," she said, her voice shaking. "He's in extreme bradycardia, maybe 3 beats per minute. Dr. Sterling, I need epinephrine, warming blankets, and an intubation kit. Now." The trauma bay exploded into controlled chaos. Doors burst open, medical personnel flooded in, and Reese Kincaid, the timid nurse who couldn't handle setting broken bones, transformed into someone none of them had ever seen before. Someone who had once been a combat surgeon. Someone who had held the line between life and death in places where the line was drawn in blood and fire. Someone who had just walked back into the war she thought she'd left behind. And the war, it turned out, had been waiting for her all along. The transformation happened in seconds. One moment, Reese Kincaid was the quiet ICU nurse who jumped at loud noises and apologized for taking up space. The next, she was someone else entirely, someone who moved with surgical precision and spoke in clipped commands that brooked no argument. "Get me vascular access on the femoral artery," she snapped, already cutting through Riggs' soaked fatigues with trauma shears. "Core temp is probably somewhere in the high 70s. We need aggressive rewarming, heated saline, warming blankets. Raise the ambient temperature in this room to 85 degrees. Dr. Sterling stood frozen in the doorway for 3 full seconds before his brain caught up. Then his professional instincts kicked in, and he was moving, shouting orders to the nurses flooding into the bay. "Someone get that dog out of here," a resident yelled as he rushed in with the defibrillator cart. Valkyrie snarled, ears flat against her skull, blocking his approach to the gurney. "Leave her," Reese commanded without looking up from where she was palpating Riggs' neck for a carotid pulse. "She stays. Just work around her." "We can't work with a wolf in the trauma bay." "Then you're going to lose the patient." Reese's eyes flashed up, and everyone in the room saw it. The steel, the absolute authority of someone who had run field hospitals under mortar fire. "That dog knows he's alive." She's not confused. She's not traumatized. She's doing her job. So do yours. The resident backed down. For the next hour, Trauma Bay 1 became a carefully choreographed dance between medical professionals and one Belgian Malinois who had appointed herself surgical assistant. Valkyrie positioned herself at the head of the gurney, lying down with her chin resting on the metal rail, watching every movement with golden eyes that tracked each person's hands like a targeting computer. When Brenda, the charge nurse, tried to insert an IV line too quickly, Valkyrie's lip curled and a low growl rumbled to her chest. "Slow down," Reese said quietly, her own hands busy threading a central line into Riggs' femoral vein. "She thinks you're hurting him. Move deliberately. No sudden gestures." Brenda slowed her movements, telegraphing each action. The growling stopped. Reese found herself falling into a rhythm she thought she'd buried 6 years ago. Her hands remembered the work, even though her mind had tried to forget. The precise angle for the femoral stick. The exact pressure needed to ventilate without barotrauma. The mental calculations running constantly in the background. Fluid volume versus warming rate versus cardiac load versus the ticking clock of cellular death. "Core temp is 82.4, the anesthesiologist called out, reading the esophageal probe. "Still hypothermic but rising. Heart rate is..." Jesus, 4 beats per minute. How is he even generating a rhythm at that rate? "He's not," Reese said, adjusting the warming blanket. "His metabolism is essentially suspended. Whatever got him into this state, it's acting like therapeutic hypothermia on steroids. Push another amp of epi, but titrate it slowly. If we shock his system too fast, we'll trigger arrhythmias. Sterling looked at her sharply. How do you know that? Because I've seen it before. Reese didn't elaborate. The monitor beeped irregularly. The green line traced erratic peaks, 4 per minute, then 3, then 5. Not enough to sustain life, not enough to qualify as alive, but not quite dead either. Riggs existed in the space between, and Valkyrie refused to let him slip into the dark. Every time the medical team's energy flagged, every time someone started to look at the clock and think about calling it, the dog would lift her head and make a sound. Not quite a whimper, not quite a growl. A reminder, a command. Keep fighting. The ultrasound probe revealed what the monitor couldn't. Riggs's heart was moving, barely. Sluggish contractions that pushed maybe 10% of normal cardiac output. But it was enough. Just enough. He's coming back, Brenda whispered, watching the cardiac waveform. BP is 70/40, temp is 86.2. Respiratory drive? Reese asked. Nothing yet, still on the vent. Then, like a message from another world, the monitor emitted a sound that made everyone in the room stop breathing. Beep, 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 beep. The rhythm was strengthening. The peaks on the ECG were growing taller, sharper. The heart was remembering how to be a heart. We have sinus rhythm, the anesthesiologist shouted. Rate is increasing, 12 per minute, 15, 20. Riggs's chest suddenly heaved, a massive gasping breath that fogged the inside of the ventilator tube. He's breathing over the vent, Sterling said, leaning forward. Spontaneous respirations. My God. Reese allowed herself 1 second, just one, to close her eyes and breathe. When she opened them, Valkyrie was staring directly at her. The dog's tail gave a single, slow wag. Good girl, Reese mouthed silently. Valkyrie's tail wagged again. Then she lowered her head back to the gurney rail and closed her eyes. Still on guard, but the crisis point had passed. They moved Riggs to the ICU 2 hours later. The sun was rising over Norfolk, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold that looked almost beautiful if you could forget the night that had preceded it. Reese rode in the elevator with the gurney, one hand resting on Valkyrie's head, feeling the warmth of the dog's skull against her palm. The hospital administration had made an exception for the canine. She was officially listed in the chart as emotional support animal, medical necessity. Nobody questioned it. Not after what they'd witnessed. Dutch was waiting in the ICU hallway when they arrived. He watched silently as they settled Riggs into a private room with monitoring equipment and warming blankets. Valkyrie immediately positioned herself under the bed, invisible to casual observers, but perfectly placed to track every person who entered the room. When the last nurse filed out, Dutch rolled his wheelchair into the doorway. You want to tell me what really happened in Helmand? He asked quietly. Reese was standing at the window, watching the sunrise. She didn't turn around. You were there, Sergeant Major. You know what happened. I know the official story. I also know it was bullshit. Dutch's voice was matter of fact. I've had 6 years to dig into it. Want to know what I found? Not particularly. Captain Declan Riggs didn't die in an IED strike. He died on your surgical table after being dug out of rubble by a certain Belgian Malinois. You operated on him for 47 minutes in the field. You did everything right, but he had a grade 5 liver laceration, and you had no blood products, no surgical suite, and no backup. He bled out despite your best efforts. Reese's hands curled into fists on the windowsill. The investigation said I was too slow to respond, that if I'd reached him 4 minutes earlier. The investigation was run by people who needed someone to blame. Dutch's wheelchair creaked as he shifted forward. Riggs was the commanding officer of a unit that lost $8 million in reconstruction funds. Funny thing about that money, it disappeared the same week Riggs died. Convenient, don't you think? Reese turned slowly. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe you should ask yourself why a man pronounced dead 6 years ago just showed up on a medevac flight with a dog who's been hunting him across 3 continents. Before Reese could respond, a sound came from the hospital bed. A groan, low and ragged. Both of them froze. Riggs' eyes fluttered open. They were gray-blue, bloodshot, and filled with confusion. His cracked lips moved, trying to form words. The ventilator tube prevented speech, but his hand, pale and scarred, lifted weakly from the blanket. Reese was at his side in 3 steps. Master Sergeant Riggs, you're at Norfolk Naval Hospital. You were hypothermic and in cardiac arrest. You're safe now, don't try to talk. But Riggs wasn't looking at her. He was looking past her, at Dutch in the doorway. And the expression on his face wasn't relief. It was terror. His hands shot out with surprising strength and grabbed Reese's wrist. His eyes were wild, pleading. He was trying to communicate something urgent, something critical. Easy, Reese said, trying to project calm while her own heart raced. You need to rest. We can talk when we remove the tube. Riggs shook his head violently. His grip tightened on her wrist hard enough to bruise. With his other hand he pointed, not at Dutch, but at his own chest. At the hospital gown covering his torso. Then he made a gesture that Reese recognized from battlefield triage. The sign for hidden weapon. No, not weapon. Hidden intel. Reese looked down at where his finger was pointing. At the bandages covering his torso where they'd placed warming pads and monitoring leads. You want me to check your wounds? She asked carefully. Riggs shook his head. He pointed more insistently at his left shoulder. Then he made a cutting gesture with his hand. Cut. He wanted her to cut something. I don't understand. Riggs's eyes rolled back. The sedation they'd given him was pulling him back under. But with the last of his strength, he mouthed a single word around the ventilator tube. Valkyrie. Then his hand went limp, and he was unconscious again. Reese stood frozen, her mind racing. She looked at Dutch, who had gone very still in his wheelchair. What is he trying to tell us? She asked. Dutch's expression was unreadable. I think that's a question you need to answer yourself. But Kincaid, do it fast, and do it when you're alone. He rolled backward and was gone before she could ask what he meant. Reese looked down at Valkyrie, who had crawled out from under the bed and was now sitting at attention, staring at Riggs's unconscious form with laser focus. What is he hiding, girl? Reese whispered. What did you two bring back from the desert? Valkyrie's only answer was to stand up, walk to the side of the bed, and place one paw deliberately on Riggs's left shoulder, the same shoulder he'd been pointing to. Then she looked at Reese and whined, a high, urgent sound. Reese's hands were shaking as she pulled on fresh gloves. She had a terrible feeling that she was about to open a door that would change everything. The shift change happened at 7 a.m. For exactly 12 minutes, the ICU hallways were chaos as night staff briefed day staff and everyone shuffled between units. Reese waited for that window. When it came, she closed the door to Riggs' room and pulled the privacy curtain. Valkyrie watched from her position at the foot of the bed, tail motionless. If anyone asks, Reese muttered, I'm checking for pressure ulcers. She carefully peeled back the hospital gown from Riggs' left shoulder. The skin was mottled with bruising, impact trauma consistent with the reported helicopter crash. But there was something else. A surgical scar, old and well-healed, running horizontally across the deltoid muscle. The scar was too clean, too deliberate to be combat-related. Reese ran her fingers along it, feeling for abnormalities in the tissue beneath. There, a slight firmness under the skin, about 2 inches from the edge of the scar. Something foreign. She grabbed a sterile scalpel from the supply cart. Her medical training screamed at her that this was insane, that she was about to perform unauthorized surgery on an unconscious patient. But every instinct honed in Afghan field hospitals told her that whatever was under that skin was worth the risk. The incision was small, precise. Blood welled up and she sponged it away with gauze. Her fingers found the object immediately, something hard and smooth, wrapped in what felt like surgical plastic. She worked it free carefully and held it up to the light. It was a micro SD card, sealed in medical-grade waterproof casing. Reese stared at it, her mind reeling. Then she looked at Valkyrie. "He didn't come back because he survived," she whispered. "He came back because he had to deliver this. And you've been protecting it, haven't you, girl?" Valkyrie's tail thumped once against the floor. The door opened. Reese's hand closed around the SD card, crushing it into her palm. She spun around, trying to look casual with a bloody scalpel in one hand and an unauthorized incision in her patient's shoulder. Agent Cross stood in the doorway. His expression was pleasant, almost friendly, but his eyes were calculating, taking in every detail of the scene. "Nurse Kincaid," he said smoothly, "I wanted to check on our miraculous patient. How is Master Sergeant Riggs doing?" "Stable," Reese managed. Her voice sounded strangled even to her own ears. "I was just checking his surgical sites." "I see." Cross stepped fully into the room and let the door close behind him. The click of the latch sounded very loud in the small space. "That's very thorough of you. Most nurses would wait for the doctor's rounds. I like to be thorough." "I've noticed." Cross moved closer, and Reese fought the urge to back away. "You know, it's fascinating. Master Sergeant Riggs was declared KIA 6 years ago in Helmand Province. His body was never recovered. And now here he is, alive and well, relatively speaking, in your hospital. Quite the coincidence. I wouldn't call hypothermic cardiac arrest well." "No, I suppose not." Cross was standing right next to the bed now, looking down at Riggs's unconscious face. "Tell me, Nurse Kincaid, did Riggs say anything before he went under? Anything unusual?" "He couldn't talk. Ventilator tube." "Of course, but sometimes patients communicate in other ways. Gestures, looks." Cross's eyes finally met hers, and they were cold as midwinter ice. "Did he try to tell you anything?" Reese's hand tightened around the SD card. The edges bit into her palm. "No." "Pity." Cross smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, I'll let you get back to work. Oh, and Nurse Kincaid, a word of advice. Sometimes the best thing we can do for our patients is not ask too many questions about where they've been or what they've done. Helps everyone sleep better at night." He left as quietly as he'd entered. Reese waited 30 seconds, then let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped the scalpel. She looked down at Riggs' face. Even unconscious, there was tension around his eyes, a tightness to his jaw that spoke of chronic stress and hypervigilance. "What did you bring back?" she whispered. "What's on this card that's worth dying for?" Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Parking garage. Level 3. 20 minutes. Come alone. Bring the dog. DH. Dutch." Reese quickly sutured Riggs' shoulder with practiced efficiency, cleaned the site, and rebandaged it. She made a few notes in his chart about wound care. Then she clipped a leash onto Valkyrie's collar. The hospital had provided one after the standoff, and headed for the elevator. Level 3 of the parking garage was mostly empty at this hour. Dutch's wheelchair was parked between a pickup truck and a concrete pillar, positioned so he could see anyone approaching from either direction. Old habits from a life lived in crosshairs. Reese approached with Valkyrie at her side. The dog's ears were up, alert but not aggressive. "You found it," Dutch said. It wasn't a question. Reese pulled the SD card from her pocket and held it up. "What is this?" "Insurance, evidence, leverage. Take your pick." Dutch gestured for her to come closer. 6 years ago, Captain Declan Riggs was the logistics officer for a reconstruction project in Helmand Province. $8.3 million in U.S. taxpayer money earmarked for building schools and infrastructure. Except the schools never got built. The infrastructure never materialized. And when investigators started asking questions, there was a very convenient IED attack that killed Riggs and destroyed all the local records. But he didn't die. No, he used something to fake his death. You operated on him for 47 minutes while he was in some kind of suspended state. Must have been hell for both of you. Reese felt sick. What are you saying? I'm saying, Dutch replied carefully, that the attack in Sangin wasn't what you think it was, and the man in that hospital bed has answers you need to hear. Because, a new voice said from behind her, it's not evidence of my crime. Reese spun around. Riggs was standing 20 feet away, leaning heavily against a car for support. He was wearing hospital scrubs and paper slippers, and he had clearly ripped out his own IV line. Blood dripped from his left hand onto the concrete. He should have been unconscious in bed. He should have been barely able to breathe. Instead, he was upright, mobile, and his eyes were clear despite the pain etched into every line of his face. How are you even standing? Reese demanded. You were hypothermic. In cardiac arrest, you should be in intensive care. Riggs's expression was grim. I'm standing because I had to. Because if I didn't get up and warn you, you'd all be dead. He gestured weakly toward the hospital. They're coming. Cross isn't working alone. None of this makes sense, Reese said. You were dead. 6 years ago in Sangin, I pronounced you. I know what you did, Riggs cut her off, and I know what you think happened. But you need to understand, I didn't die in Sangin. I was never dead. Dutch's eyes narrowed. Tetrodotoxin. Riggs met his gaze and nodded slowly. Tetrodotoxin? Reese's mind raced through her medical training. The paralytic toxin from pufferfish? You faked your own death? You let me operate on you while you were conscious and paralyzed? The horror in her voice made Riggs flinch. I had no choice. They were going to kill me, kill everyone who knew about the missing funds. I had to disappear completely. So you endured 47 minutes of field surgery while fully aware, Dutch said quietly, feeling every incision, every attempt to restart your heart. He shook his head. That's a level of commitment I've never seen. Or cowardice, Reese said, her voice shaking with anger. You let me think I killed you. Let me carry that guilt for 6 years. Let Dutch take the fall for your death. You destroyed careers and lives because you were too scared to fight. I know. Riggs's face was haggard. And I'm sorry, but I'm fighting now. That SD card has everything. Bank records, communications, orders signed by people whose names you'd recognize. I've spent 6 years tracking down every piece of evidence, and now I'm ready to burn it all down. Why now? Dutch asked. Because they found me. 3 days ago in Prague. I barely escaped. Riggs gestured to his battered body. The helicopter crash wasn't an accident. They shot us down. Everyone else on that bird is dead. I only survived because Valkyrie pulled me from the wreckage, and I managed to trigger a controlled hypothermia protocol before I bled out. He looked at Reese. I didn't come here for treatment. I came here because this is where you work, and you're the only person on Earth I knew I could trust. The only person who would save me even after what I did to you. You're insane, Reese breathed. Maybe. Riggs took a shaky step forward. But I'm also right. And I need your help. We need to get this information to someone who can expose. He stopped mid-sentence. His eyes had gone to something over Reese's shoulder. She turned. Agent Cross was walking toward them from the elevator bank. He wasn't alone. 2 men in tactical gear flanked him, weapons held low but ready. Well, Cross said pleasantly, isn't this convenient? All my problems in one parking garage. Dutch's hand moved towards something under his wheelchair blanket. I wouldn't, Cross said. The tactical team's weapons came up slightly. You're pushing 70, Holloway. Heroic, but ultimately futile. 69, Dutch corrected. And this wheelchair is a prop, you smug bastard. In one fluid motion, Dutch stood up from the chair. His supposed paralysis vanished like smoke. In his hand was a compact pistol that had been hidden in the seat cushion. Cross's eyes widened. You've been faking for 6 years? Yeah, turns out I'm not as broken as I look. Dutch's voice was ice. Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to let Kincaid and Riggs walk out of here. You can have me. I'm old, I'm tired, and frankly, I'm ready to see what's on the other side. But they walk. Noble, Cross said, but no. The next 10 seconds happened in a blur. Cross drew his weapon. Dutch fired first, hitting one of the tactical officers in the shoulder. The man went down, screaming. Valkyrie launched herself at the second officer with a snarl that sounded like tearing metal. Riggs shoved Reese behind a concrete pillar and pulled a small pistol from somewhere in his scrubs. Gunfire echoed through the parking garage like thunder in a canyon. Reese pressed herself against the pillar, her medical training screaming that she should be helping the wounded, but her survival instinct keeping her frozen. She could hear Dutch's weapon barking, methodical and controlled. Could hear Valkyrie's savage growls and a man's screams. Could hear Riggs breathing hard beside her. Then the cacophony stopped. Tentatively, Reese peered around the pillar. Dutch was still standing, his weapon trained on Agent Cross, who was on his knees with blood streaming from gunshot wounds to both thighs. The two tactical officers were down, one unconscious from Valkyrie's assault, the other clutching his shoulder and moaning. Valkyrie stood over Cross, teeth bared, waiting for the command to finish it. "Don't," Riggs said, stepping out from cover. "We need him alive. He knows who else is involved." Cross laughed, a wet, pained sound. "You think I'm going to talk? You think—" Dutch shot him in the other thigh. Cross's scream echoed off concrete. "Now you have about 15 minutes before you bleed out," Dutch said conversationally, "unless Nurse Kincaid here decides to apply pressure to those femoral wounds, which she might do if you start answering questions. Or she might not." All eyes turned to Reese. She stood frozen, staring at the blood pooling on the concrete, at the wounded men, at the gun in Dutch's steady hand, at Riggs, who looked like death warmed over, at Valkyrie, who was watching her with those golden eyes, waiting for a command. This wasn't medicine. This was war. And somehow, impossibly, she was right back in the middle of it. "Kincaid," Dutch said quietly, "the SD card, we need to know what's on it before we decide what to do with these assholes." Reese's hand went to her pocket. The card was still there, a tiny piece of plastic that apparently held enough secrets to justify murder. She pulled out her phone, slotted the card into the adapter, and opened the files. What she saw made her blood run cold. Bank records, communications, but more than that, mission orders. Signed authorizations for operations that weren't supposed to exist. Names of soldiers who had died in attacks that were listed as enemy action, but were actually something else entirely. Friendly fire, deliberate targeting, assassination. The Sangan attack that had killed Riggs hadn't been Taliban. It had been a cleanup operation authorized by someone with the codename Mongoose. And Riggs wasn't the only target. The 4 soldiers who had died, the ones the investigation blamed Reese for being too slow to save, had been murdered, specifically targeted because they had discovered the missing reconstruction funds. And Reese hadn't been too slow. She'd been lied to, set up, sacrificed to cover up the truth. Her hands started shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone. "They weren't collateral damage," she whispered. "They were executed. And I was the cover story." Dutch's expression was grim. "Now you understand." Reese looked up at Cross, who was still on his knees, blood spreading across the concrete. "Who gave the order?" she asked, her voice deadly quiet. "Who is Mongoose?" Cross just smiled through his pain. "You'll never prove it. That data is 6 years old, inadmissible. And even if you could," he never finished the sentence. Because Valkyrie, who had been silent and still, suddenly went rigid. Her ears swiveled toward the parking garage entrance. A growl built in her chest. Not the warning rumble from before, but something deeper, primal. The growl of a predator who had just detected a bigger threat. "We need to move," Dutch said urgently. "Now." Val's signaling backup. "Where do we go?" Riggs asked. He was swaying on his feet, his brief surge of adrenaline fading fast. Dutch looked at Reese. "That depends. You in this fight or not?" Reese looked at the phone in her hand, at the evidence of betrayal and murder, at her own name in an after-action report that labeled her as incompetent, negligent, responsible for deaths that weren't accidental at all. She thought about 6 years of guilt, 6 years of hiding, 6 years of believing she wasn't good enough, wasn't fast enough, wasn't worthy of being called a surgeon. Something crystallized in her chest, something hard and bright and absolutely furious. "I'm in," she said, "but we do this my way. No more running, no more hiding. We take this public. We burn it all down." Dutch grinned, a wolf's grin, full of teeth and hunger. "Now that's the Doc Kincaid I remember." The sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the garage. "Time to go," Riggs said, and Reese Kincaid, who had spent 6 years trying to be small and quiet and invisible, ran toward the sound of sirens with a war dog at her side and classified secrets in her pocket. The war had found her again. This time, she wasn't going to lose. They made it to Dutch's pickup truck, a battered Ford F-250 that looked like it had survived several wars, before the first black SUV screeched into the parking garage. Riggs was fading fast, his skin gray and clammy despite the adrenaline still flooding his system. Reese practically threw him into the back seat while Valkyrie leaped in after him, positioning herself between Riggs and the rear window like a living shield. Dutch was behind the wheel before Reese's door was fully closed. For a man who'd spent 6 years pretending to be paralyzed, he moved with shocking agility. The truck's engine roared to life, and they were moving, tires squealing on concrete. "They'll have the exits blocked," Reese said, gripping the door handle as Dutch took a corner hard enough to make the truck lean. "I know this garage," Dutch replied, his voice utterly calm. "Built in 1987. I consulted on security. There's a maintenance tunnel on level 2 that connects to the loading dock. Most people don't know it exists." He proved it 30 seconds later, whipping the truck through a narrow opening and into a concrete tunnel barely wide enough for the vehicle. The side mirrors scraped against the walls with a horrible screeching sound. Then they burst out into daylight and the loading dock area, merging into morning traffic before the pursuing vehicles realized they'd escaped. Reese twisted in her seat to check on Riggs. He was slumped against the door, eyes half closed. Valkyrie had her head resting on his lap, watching his face with intense focus. "He's crashing," Reese said. "His body can't take much more. He needs a hospital." "Can't go to a hospital," Riggs mumbled. "They'll find us." "He's right," Dutch said. "Every medical facility in Virginia will be flagged within the hour. We need someplace off the grid." "I know a place," Riggs said, forcing his eyes open. "Safe house, 40 minutes from here. Abandoned farm outside Petersburg." Dutch glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "How secure?" "I booby-trapped it. Anyone who's been there uninvited is dead." Reese felt a chill. The man she'd thought was a victim had become something else entirely during his 6 years underground. Someone who thought in terms of kill zones and dead drops. "What exactly did you become, Riggs?" she asked quietly. His eyes met hers in the mirror. "Whatever I had to be to survive." They drove in silence, leaving Norfolk behind. Reese pulled out her phone and looked at the SD card data again. The Sangan attack had been authorized by Mongoose. The order had been specific. Eliminate the 4 soldiers who had discovered the missing reconstruction funds and make it look like enemy action. Riggs had been a target too, but he'd seen it coming and faked his death. The other 4 hadn't been so lucky, and Reese had been the perfect patsy. "I need to know," she said, her voice tight. "The 47 minutes I spent trying to save you, were you awake the whole time?" Riggs was quiet for a long moment. "Yes, you felt everything. Every incision, every clamp, every time you tried to restart my heart." His voice was hollow. "Tetrodotoxin paralyzed my muscles, but left my nerves fully functional. It was like being buried alive while someone performed surgery on you. Jesus Christ, Reese whispered. I wanted to tell you I was alive, that you were doing everything right, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak. All I could do was lie there and hope you'd give up before you accidentally killed me for real. The truck turned onto a dirt road that wound through overgrown farmland. Reese could see a barn in the distance, half collapsed and covered in kudzu. The farmhouse beside it wasn't much better. Broken windows, sagging roof, the general air of abandonment. Home sweet home, Riggs muttered. Dutch parked behind the barn, out of sight from the main road. They helped Riggs inside. He could barely walk now. The interior of the farmhouse was surprisingly intact. There was a camping stove, MRE boxes, a sleeping bag, and in the corner, a metal footlocker covered in warning stickers. That's the evidence cache, Riggs said, collapsing onto the sleeping bag. Everything I've collected over 6 years. Reese knelt beside him, checking his pulse. Thready and weak. You're going into shock. I need to examine your wounds. No time, Riggs grabbed her wrist. Listen, if they find us, we're all dead. You need to take the evidence and run. Get it to someone who can expose Mongoose before they bury it. I'm not leaving you, Reese said firmly. A ghost of a smile crossed Riggs' face. Stubborn. You'll need that. Dutch was at the window. We've got maybe an hour before they track us, probably less. Valkyrie suddenly went rigid. Her ears swiveled toward the door, and a growl built in her chest. The deep, primal sound that meant imminent danger. Or maybe 30 seconds, Dutch amended, pulling his pistol. The sound of vehicles approaching was unmistakable now. Multiple engines. The basement, Riggs gasped. There's a tunnel to the barn. Go, now. I told you I'm not. The front door exploded inward in a shower of splinters. 3 men in tactical gear poured through, weapons raised. Behind them came Agent Cross, limping badly. His thighs were wrapped in hasty bandages, soaked through with blood. His face was twisted in pain and fury. Really thought you'd killed me? Cross snarled. Dutch fired, hitting one operator in the chest. The man went down, but his body armor absorbed the impact. He was already rolling to cover. The farmhouse became a war zone. Dutch moved with fluid efficiency, using the doorframe for cover, making every shot count. But he was outnumbered and outgunned. Valkyrie didn't wait for a command. She launched herself at the nearest operator with a snarl that could have come from hell itself. The man's screams echoed through the small space. Reese grabbed Riggs and started dragging him toward the back room. He was dead weight, unable to help. Kincaid, go! Dutch shouted, firing twice more. Get him out! Not without you. I'm right behind you. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Reese found the basement door and yanked it open. She half-dragged, half-carried Riggs down steep wooden stairs. Valkyrie appeared at the top, blood on her muzzle, and bounded down after them. Behind them, the gunfire intensified, Dutch emptying his magazine in controlled bursts. Then an explosion. Flash bang. Reese heard Dutch's weapon clatter to the floor. Boots stomping, shouted commands. Hands! Show me your hands! Dutch's voice, hoarse but defiant. Go to hell! The sound of a rifle butt hitting flesh. A grunt of pain. Then Cross's voice, venomous. Where are they, old man? Dutch laughed, a wet, pained sound. You're too late, they're gone. And you just assaulted a decorated war hero. Hope it was worth it. Reese's hands shook. Dutch was alive. Captured, but alive. She had to keep moving. The basement was dark and smelled of earth. Reese found a flashlight on a shelf and flicked it on. The beam revealed a narrow tunnel leading into darkness. Go, Riggs whispered. Tunnel comes out in the barn. Dirt bike under the hay. They crawled through the darkness, Reese pulling Riggs when he couldn't move. The tunnel seemed endless, narrowing until her shoulders scraped the walls. Then fresh air. The tunnel opened into the barn's lower level. The dirt bike was exactly where Riggs said, a beat-up Honda. The engine turned over on the first try. Get on, she ordered Riggs. Can't. You don't have a choice. She hauled him onto the bike behind her, his arms wrapped weakly around her waist. Valkyrie looked at the bike, calculating. Val, run alongside, Reese commanded. Stay with us. Through the barn doors, she could see the black SUVs. She could hear voices inside the farmhouse, searching. She gunned the engine and exploded out of the barn. The dirt bike kicked up dust and gravel. Shouts erupted. Gunfire cracked. Reese hunched low. Riggs pressed against her back and opened the throttle. Valkyrie ran beside them, matching the bike's speed with ground-eating strides. They hit the tree line doing 50. Branches whipped at Reese's face. The bike wasn't built for this, but she pushed it anyway, following a barely visible trail. Behind them, the SUVs couldn't follow, too wide for the narrow trail, but they'd have helicopters, drones. Reese's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. FBI Field Office, Richmond. Ask for Special Agent Morse. She's clean. Trust no one else. DH, Dutch. He'd sent it before the confrontation. Tears stung Reese's eyes. The stubborn bastard had thought of everything. Richmond, she shouted over the engine. We're going to Richmond. Riggs didn't respond. His grip had gone slack. Stay with me, Riggs, she yelled. You don't get to die. The trail opened onto a paved road. Reese took a hard right, heading north. The bike wasn't built for highway speeds, but she pushed it to 70, weaving through traffic while Valkyrie ran on the shoulder. The evidence was back at the farmhouse, in that footlocker. If Cross's team found it, 6 years of work would be destroyed. Unless... Reese thought about the SD card in her pocket. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. Financial records, communications, kill orders signed by Mongoose. It had to be enough. Richmond appeared on the horizon. Reese navigated to the FBI field office, one-handed, praying she wouldn't crash. The federal building was imposing, concrete and steel. Reese pulled up to the entrance, killed the engine, and practically fell off the bike. Riggs slumped sideways. She caught him before he hit pavement. I need help, she shouted at security guards approaching with hands on weapons. I need Special Agent Morse. It's urgent. Ma'am, you can't. I'm a nurse at Norfolk Naval Hospital. This man is a federal witness with information about a DOD conspiracy. We've been attacked. People are dead. I need Agent Morse now. Something in her voice made the guard pause. He spoke into his radio. 5 minutes later, Reese sat in an interrogation room with Riggs on the floor, Valkyrie standing guard, and a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s studying them with professional skepticism. Special Agent Diana Morse looked like she'd seen every con in the book. But when Reese handed her the SD card and started explaining, Morse's expression shifted from skeptical to alarmed. These are classified DOD communications, Morse said, scrolling through files. Where did you get this? From him, Reese gestured to Riggs. Master Sergeant Declan Riggs, declared KIA 6 years ago. Except he didn't die. He was targeted for assassination because he discovered an embezzlement scheme. That's serious. It's the truth. The people behind it just tried to kill us. They're probably monitoring federal buildings right now. Morse's jaw tightened. She closed the laptop and stood. Come with me. She led them deeper into the building, through security doors, into a SCIF, completely isolated from outside surveillance. You'll be safe while I verify this, Morse said. If you're right, this is the biggest DOD corruption case in decades. It's bigger than corruption, Riggs said weakly. It's murder. Sanctioned assassination of American soldiers. Mongoose is still active, still in power. Morse's eyes narrowed. Mongoose? I've heard that code name. Where? Reese demanded. I can't discuss it, but if you're right... Morse pulled out her phone, then reconsidered. I need to make calls. From a secure line. Don't leave this room. She left, locking the door. Reese turned to Riggs. His skin was gray, breathing shallow. She didn't have equipment, but she assessed. Weak pulse. Signs of internal bleeding. You need surgery, she said. Real surgery. Not yet. Riggs grabbed her hand. If Mongoose figures out we're alive, they'll come for us. Here, in a federal building. As if summoned, alarms blared throughout the facility. The door burst open. Two men in FBI tactical gear, weapons drawn, moving with military precision. But their movements were too smooth. Two special forces. Valkyrie knew. She positioned herself between the men and Reese, growling. "Stand down," one man said. "We're evacuating. Security breach." "Where's Agent Morse?" Reese asked. "Securing evidence. Come with us." The men stepped forward. Valkyrie attacked. She went for the lead man's weapon hand. He screamed as titanium teeth sheared through Kevlar. His partner swung his weapon toward the dog. Reese moved on pure instinct. 6 years ago, Dutch had taught her to fight. She grabbed the second man's weapon, twisted it while stepping into his space, drove her knee into his groin. As he doubled over, she brought her elbow down on his neck. He dropped. The first man was screaming, trying to shake Valkyrie loose. Reese grabbed his fallen weapon, a Glock 19. "Valkyrie, ouse!" "Release." Valkyrie let go but stayed ready. "Who sent you?" Reese demanded. The man glared. "You're dead, all of you. Mongoose doesn't leave loose ends." A gunshot from the doorway. The man's head snapped back. Behind him stood Agent Morse, weapon raised, face a mask of fury. "That was Deputy Director Harrison's security team," Morse said. "Contractors. Harrison is compromised." "Mongoose," Riggs said from the floor. "No." Morse lowered her weapon. "Harrison is middle management, but he takes orders from someone higher, and they just activated a kill team in a federal building. We need to leave. Now." She helped Reese get Riggs to his feet. Together they moved through corridors, erupting into chaos. Alarms, agents running, confused shouts. Morse led them to a service elevator. "This goes to the garage. My car is on level 2. The elevator descended. "Where can we go?" Reese asked. "I don't know yet." The doors opened onto the garage. Morse's car was a nondescript sedan. They piled in, Riggs in back, Reese beside him, Valkyrie in cargo. Morse started the engine and pulled out. They almost made it. A black SUV blocked the exit. Agent Cross stepped out, limping badly, bandages soaked with blood. But his eyes were clear and his weapon steady. "End of the line," Cross said. Morse reversed, but more SUVs pulled in behind. Boxed in. "Give me the evidence," Cross called. "Walk away. You can't win this. Mongoose has reach you can't imagine. Every agency, every level. You're 3 people against an empire." Reese looked at Morse, at Riggs, at Valkyrie. 3 people and a dog against an empire. Then she noticed something. Cross was in shooter's stance, but his hands were shaking. Not from nerves, from blood loss. He'd been shot twice by Dutch. He'd survived, patched himself up, kept fighting. But the human body could only take so much. Cross was running on fumes. "You're dying," Reese called through the window. "Those femoral wounds. You've got maybe 30 minutes before hemorrhagic shock." "Then we'd better be quick," Cross replied. "Or I could save your life. I'm a trauma surgeon. I can stabilize those wounds. But you have to tell us who Mongoose is." Cross laughed, harsh and wet. "You think I think you're about to die for someone who sees you as expendable," Reese interrupted. "How many people has Mongoose sacrificed to cover their tracks?" Cross's weapon wavered. "Dutch was Delta Force," Reese continued. "Sergeant Major Dutch Holloway. He died protecting us. Died fighting people who forgot what the uniform meant." Something flickered in Cross's eyes. "Holloway's dead? You killed him." Cross's jaw tightened. For a long moment, the only sound was his labored breathing. Then he lowered his weapon. "Deputy Director Harrison," he said. "But he's not the top. He reports to someone in the Pentagon. I don't have a name. Everything goes through dead drops." "How do we find them?" Morse asked. "You can't. But Harrison knows he's the only one with direct contact. Cross swayed. His face had gone paper pale. "Now help me." Reese got out slowly. Valkyrie growled, but Reese quieted her. She approached Cross. When she got close, she could see the truth in his eyes. He wasn't planning an ambush. He was just a man who'd realized he'd chosen the wrong side. "Lie down," she ordered. Cross lowered himself to concrete. Reese examined the wounds, hasty bandaging that had slowed bleeding but not stopped it. She improvised pressure dressings using her jacket and belt as tourniquets. "You'll live," she said, "but you need surgery." "I know." Cross's voice was weak. "I'll turn myself in, cooperate fully, but Mongoose has contingencies. If Harrison goes down, there are protocols to destroy evidence." "Then we move fast," Morse said, phone out. "I'm bringing in the FBI director directly, bypassing chain of command. We raid Harrison's office, home, every location simultaneously." She looked at Reese. "I need you to testify, everything you know." Reese nodded. "On one condition. Dutch Holloway gets full honors, military funeral, recognition." Done. The next 12 hours were a blur. FBI raids, arrests, interrogations. Deputy Director Harrison was taken into custody at home, still in pajamas, face shocked when agents burst through his door. His computer files revealed everything: communications with Mongoose, financial transfers, kill orders, and buried in encrypted folders, a name: Undersecretary of Defense Marcus Pemberton, a man who'd quietly manipulated DoD contracts for 15 years, who'd ordered the deaths of 37 American soldiers to cover his tracks, who'd built an empire of corruption inside the institution meant to defend the nation. The arrest started within hours. Pemberton, his network of contractors and officials, the tactical teams that had served as his private death squad. Agent Cross cooperated fully. His testimony corroborated everything. By evening, the story had broken nationally. Every news channel carried it. Massive Pentagon corruption scandal. Undersecretary arrested for murder of U.S. soldiers. Reese watched from a hospital room where Riggs was finally getting proper surgery. Valkyrie sat at Reese's feet, finally at rest. "We did it," Reese whispered to the dog. Valkyrie's tail thumped once. Later, after Riggs was stable, Morse found Reese in the cafeteria. "There's someone who wants to meet you," Morse said. She led Reese to a private room where a man in a wheelchair waited. Reese's breath caught. Dutch Holloway looked like he'd been through a war, left arm in a sling, bandages covering half his chest, face bruised and swollen, but alive. "You're alive," Reese breathed. "Disappointed?" Dutch asked with a ghost of a smile. "How?" "Body armor under my shirt, Kevlar vest I've worn for 6 years. Caught 3 of 4 shots. The 4th went through my shoulder. Hurts like hell but missed vitals." He shrugged with his good shoulder. "I played dead. When they left to chase you, I crawled to my truck and drove to the hospital." Reese crossed the room and hugged him carefully. "I thought you died for us," she said. "I was willing to, but turns out I'm too stubborn." He pulled back. "You did good, Kincaid. Better than good. You saved lives." Expose the truth. That's what being a surgeon is about. Not just scalpel work, fighting for your patients when everyone else has given up. "I couldn't have done it without you, without Riggs, without Val." "No, you couldn't have. But that's the point. Nobody fights alone." Morse cleared her throat. "There's going to be a congressional hearing. They want both of you to testify." "We'll be there," Reese said. 1 year later, Reese stood in front of a different building. The sign read, Shadow Haven K-9 Medical Training Center, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. The facility was brand new, funded by a DoD desperate to rebuild its reputation. It trained the next generation of combat medical K-9 handlers, teaching not just battlefield surgery, but the bond between soldier and dog that could mean the difference between life and death. Reese was the director. Lieutenant Colonel Reese Kincaid, recalled to active duty with full honors and a formal apology for Sangan. Dutch was Senior Tactical Advisor, official title, Pain in the Ass Consultant. He'd abandoned the wheelchair and now walked with a slight limp and a cane he claimed was mostly for show. Valkyrie was lead training dog, teaching younger canines the skills that had saved so many lives. Declan Riggs had been pardoned and given a medal. After 6 months' recovery, he ran Shadow Haven's security division. On this morning, Reese taught a class of 30 young medical officers. They sat in neat rows, eager and attentive. Being a combat surgeon isn't just about technical skill, Reese told them. It's about making impossible choices under impossible conditions, trusting your instincts and your team, and sometimes fighting for your patients when the enemy isn't a disease or injury, but the system itself. She paused, looking at the young faces. 6 years ago, I thought I'd failed, thought I'd killed a patient through incompetence. I let that guilt destroy my career, my confidence, my sense of self. But I learned something important. Sometimes the wounds we carry aren't failures. They're evidence we were in the fight, that we cared enough to risk everything. From the back, Dutch gave a subtle nod. Your job isn't to be perfect, Reese continued. It's to be present, to show up for your patients even when you're scared, to trust your training and team, and to never give up as long as there's even the smallest chance of saving a life. She gestured. Valkyrie trotted to the front and sat at attention. This is Valkyrie. Over her career, she's detected 53 IEDs, located 37 wounded soldiers in collapsed buildings, and saved more lives than I can count. She's also my partner, my friend, and the reason I'm standing here instead of hiding in some nowhere hospital trying to forget who I used to be. Reese placed her hand on Valkyrie's head. The dog leaned into the touch. Learn from the dogs, Reese said softly. They don't second-guess themselves. They don't carry guilt for things beyond their control. They do their job, trust their pack, and never stop fighting for the people they love. She looked at her forearm, where her tattoo was visible above her rolled sleeve. The medical caduceus crossed with a canine paw print. Some scars are badges of honor, she said. Reminders not of failure, but of survival. Of battles fought and lessons learned. Wear them proudly. They prove you were strong enough to be broken and brave enough to heal. The class sat in thoughtful silence. Then someone started clapping. One person, then another, until the entire room applauded. Reese felt her throat tighten, but she kept composure, giving the class a crisp salute they returned. After they filed out, Dutch rolled up beside her. He wasn't in the wheelchair. He just liked it for the cup holder. Hell of a speech, Colonel. Learn from the best, Sergeant Major. Damn right. Dutch sipped his coffee. Riggs wants to see you. Something about new leads on Pemberton's international contacts. The rabbit hole goes deeper. Of course it does, Reese sighed, but she smiled. Evil never takes a day off. Neither do we. Riggs appeared from the security office, walking with a slight limp. He joined them on the hill overlooking the training grounds. They're good kids, he said, watching handlers below. Remind me of us, before everything went to shit. We weren't that young, Dutch said. We were that stupid, Reese countered. All three laughed, a sound that felt foreign after everything. I owe you both an apology, Riggs said quietly, for Sangan, for the 6 years, for everything. Dutch waved it off. You did what you had to. No. Riggs's voice was firm. I let Reese carry guilt that wasn't hers. I let you take the fall. I was a coward. You were scared, Reese said. There's a difference. Is there? Yeah, she looked at him. A coward stays scared. You came back. You fought. That's what matters. Dutch cleared his throat. For what it's worth, you two are the reason I'm alive. If Reese hadn't fought for this program, if Riggs hadn't exposed Pemberton, I'd have spent the rest of my life in that wheelchair pretending to be broken. He looked at them. You gave me my life back, so we're even. Valkyrie, sensing the emotion, walked over and sat between the three of them. To the pack, Dutch said. To the pack, Reese and Riggs echoed. They stood as the sun set, three broken people who'd found a way to heal, not by forgetting the past, but by facing it together. The sun painted the sky amber and gold. Reese paused to watch, Valkyrie beside her, Dutch with his hand on her shoulder. You know what Dutch told me once? Reese said quietly. That the best warriors aren't the ones who never fall. They're the ones who get back up. Sounds like something a wise old bastard would say, Dutch replied. Yeah, it does. Valkyrie's tail wagged slowly as the three of them stood in fading light. Three survivors, three fighters, three souls who'd been through hell and come out not unscathed, but unbroken. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. One of the trainees learning to trust their handler the way Valkyrie had learned to trust Reese in the Afghan desert. The sound echoed across the base like a promise, like a mission order, like a reminder that some bonds transcend death, betrayal, and time itself. The Guardian protocol was simple. Never abandon your pack. Never stop fighting. Never surrender to darkness. And always, always trust the dog. Because the dog knows. The dog always knows.